I want to believe that things are going to get better soon. I think that it is that we've trapped ourselves in a situation. We're getting out has a lot of negative consequences. I mean, you what you're saying, that there are a lot of people that are like us that are speaking out now. I think a very small minority of us are able to continue on and make a living.
Yes,
while espousing.
Don't say us either. That yes, exactly. It's not necessarily.
Right. I mean,
you or me.
I'm barely in this camp, right? But but there's so few of us for whom it is even like a reasonable dream that you can hold these views and still, be in the intellectual discourse in one way or another and make a living. For the vast majority of people, this is not a reality. This is not something they can count on. And to espouse these views means losing their job. Increasingly in the culture-making institutions, right? Increasingly in academia, in the media as a whole, in various cultural, like just arts-based institutions. So if you're in these kinds of spaces, these spaces which have huge influence on what we think as a society and how we feel as a society and how we understand our current moments, and articulate them. If you want to participate and be a thinking person, you want to be a writer, you want to be a journalist, writing an anti-woke thing might get you blacklisted in so many different places. It's already hard to make it as a journalist. So, are you going to take this risk?
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghandaum. My guest, whose voice you just heard, is Sarah Haider. I'm going to tell you about her in a minute, but first, a little housekeeping, some exciting housekeeping, actually. Last week in my interview with Jonathan Haidt, you may have heard me talk about a project that I've been working on over the last several months. It is, for lack of a better descriptor, a heterodox space for women. You can go back and listen to that interview if you missed it for a fuller explanation. But suffice it to say, I have been interested in the fact that this whole free thought space, and that would be the world of podcasters and YouTubers and sense makers who are known for pushing back against groupthink, is a pretty male-dominated space. There are exceptions, of course, and my guest today is among them. But given the number of women I hear from all the time, and that's not just media types, but regular women in the world, about how alone they have begun to feel as their social circles have become more tribal, and how this doesn't just bother them, but genuinely hurts them, it has become clear to me that there is a void out there that really needs to be filled. So I am creating something called the Unspeakeasy. It's an intellectual community for free-thinking women. And while it's still very much a work in progress, I can tell you that it will exist both online and in real life and have any number of offerings that I am in the process of figuring out. A few weeks ago, I took a group of women out into the desert to have a 3-day brainstorming session about the whole thing, and it was amazing, and I feel there are many more to come. So if you want to learn about what we're up to, you can go to theunspeakeasy.com. There's a little memo from me and an opportunity for you to get on the mailing list and also tell me what you might be looking for from such a community. If you are not a woman, don't fret. I'm also planning to build out the larger Unspeakable community, even beyond the Patreon. And that, of course, is and will remain for everyone. Anyway, my guest is Sarah Haider. She is an activist, a writer, and has been a noted figure in the so-called New Atheist movement. That is due to her having founded in 2013 the advocacy group Exmuslims of North America. That work led her to the trenches of the new free speech and free think movements, and she now writes on Substack, covering issues around race, identity, gender, and social politics of various sorts. Sarah and I have a lot of overlapping interests, so I wanted to have her on the show to talk about them. I will say that when we recorded this conversation, we spent almost the entire first hour talking about her upbringing. Sarah came to this country at age 7 when she immigrated with her parents from Pakistan. And she was a devout Muslim until she had a radical change of perspective as a teenager. But even though that stuff was really interesting, I thought the interview really took off after we covered that stuff. So if you're listening to the regular public version of this podcast, you won't hear that part. The entire uncut interview is available on the Patreon page, which you can find at patreon.com/theunspeakable. Otherwise, here is my more concise but still pretty long interview with Sarah Haider. Sarah Haider, welcome to The Unspeakable.
I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me, Meghan.
I've been following you for a long time, and I really admire not only your work, but just the way you present yourself. I think that you have a ton of integrity, and you're just really very, very clear and very just grounded in your whole approach. So I want to talk about all that, but just so people are familiar with you and your background, you are the co-founder of the advocacy group Exmuslims of North America. I guess in the past 10 years or so? You've been active, for 9 or 10 years?
Yeah, about that time. We started forming around 2013. That's when we incorporated. And then we were a nonprofit by 2014. So it's almost a decade.
Okay. And so since then, you've expanded beyond the kind of new atheist movement that group was kind of associated with. And you're really involved in the free speech arena more broadly. So I guess I just wanted to start off by asking, what do you spend most of your time thinking about and talking about these days?
Well, it was kind of a natural journey from ex-Muslim activism, and especially being grounded in the activist space to beginning to think about what was wrong with the activist space and, what we needed to do more generally to have the kind of society that fosters healthy dialogue. And it's, in my work, there's lots of, literal impediments to free speech that we encounter, right? There's blasphemy laws across the world. There's apostasy laws across the world. There's all kinds of speech restrictions that become a kind of blasphemy law. And in the United States, we don't really have to worry about that very much. But the discourse is still not as healthy as it could be. And this was one of the more surprising things that I learned through the course of my activism. And actually, it became clear to me very, very quickly within a couple of years of starting to speak about ex-Muslim issues publicly within the atheist circles and then more broadly among just as general population. It became very clear to me that something was wrong. And at first I just didn't know what it was. And I was thinking about, for years, I've been thinking about what is it that's gone wrong and how is it that's gone wrong? And I think a lot of people are in this similar space of being confused with how certain strands of, political discourse, behave, and with how maybe their tribe is now behaving, and what they thought to be the principles that their group was formed around were maybe not the principles that it was formed around. There was something else that was happening. And I think that there were a lot of people I noticed around the same time that were voicing this kind of confusion and discontent, I guess, with what I could call vaguely liberal, progressive leftist politics. And I consider myself as part of that movement. So I've been thinking about those things to various degrees for a very long time.
So that was a few years ago now. In the years since, you have, found yourself in this space that I'm also in, and a number of, mutual friends and colleagues, where we're just kind of constantly pushing back against whatever this is. I'm reluctant to use the word wokeism, although I haven't really found a better one. I don't know really what my question is. What is bothering you the most these days? Because certainly there are a lot of us talking about this a lot of the time. And yet I'm not sure if things are getting better or worse or changing in any meaningful way. What do you think?
I think they're getting worse. I mean, I would say that very clearly. I've been saying that everywhere, which is, I feel bad about it because then you feel like this, prophet of doom and the person bringing in bad news. But I think that, I had a piece, a back and forth on Letter Wiki back in the day when it was running. I think they've become absorbed by Substack or something. But I had a letter exchange with Ayaan Hirsi Ali. And it ended up becoming about wokeism. And we first, we had like a little pre-chat before we engaged in this. And, we were thinking we could talk about all these things, but it became clear that both of us were thinking very much about wokeism. So even though Islam was the natural topic of discussion, it became wokeism that we were concerned with. And she and I wrote back and forth quite a few times. I think I wrote 3 letters, she wrote 2. And my contention was, right from the get-go, that they've already won. I mean, I think it's very clear in my mind that this is just, what we're seeing is not quite a takeover. It's just the explicit, manifestations of a takeover that already happened in all the meaningful ways that it needs to happen. Because it's not the case that social change happens because it convinces the majority of the people. That doesn't happen. It doesn't happen like that anywhere, even in democracies. Can you convince the right people? Can you manipulate 1 or 2 aspects of the norms of your society, or even sometimes even legal norms or practices in your favor in a way that helps those few people that are very much believers in that ideology? So it doesn't, I mean, I've seen this happen in the Muslim world over and over, although those are not what you can't call those democracies. But at the same time, it wasn't the case that the majority of people ever believed in, the extreme view. And yet the extreme view took over very, very quickly. So I don't think that what we're seeing here is altogether different. Although the specifics of it are very different, but it is still the case that the right people that needed to be convinced that this was the right religion already have been, and that the way back is difficult to impossible in certain circumstances. So how do you go back now?
Okay, so but the right people have been convinced. You're talking about people have been absorbed into sort of social justice ideology. I mean, I would call it sort of like reductive social justice ideology, again, because nobody is against social justice. Right? See, this is the great trick, right? Like nobody is not anti-racist just on its face. Nobody's against social justice, but these terms have been recruited to give cover to something that's a lot more, I don't want to say pernicious. This sounds very conspiratorial, but it's simplistic to the point of destructiveness, I guess. But Sarah, here's the thing. Most people hate this. Like the vast, vast majority of people, it doesn't matter because the institutions have been captured.
The institutions have been captured. The elite has been captured, right? The people with the credentials, the people who are graduating from our top schools, our brightest young people have been captured, and they will go into the kinds of positions where their opinion matters more than everybody else's. And no one likes to hear this, but it is the case that the opinion of a Harvard grad matters more than the opinion of, somebody who graduated from University of Tennessee, middle of their class or whatever. I mean, that's the reality of the world that we're living in which certain people have more power and prestige and even natural gifts, right? And they can use them towards a certain goal or towards another. And what makes me feel very part of the negativity here, or I don't know,
pessimism,
right? Part of the pessimism here is to see how within the elite itself that there's such clear uniformity. I mean, if you look at any social movement, it is not ever pure populism. It is never purely the people have finally risen up, and they're standing up against X or Y or Z. There's always there's a certain contingent of elite support for any particular cause, and that's necessary for it to have foothold in a naturally hierarchical society. So we need is certain amount of elite to disagree with their peers and to step up and be courageous. I'm pessimistic, but that's not to say that I think it's impossible, but I think it will be hard.
I mean, what frustrates me too is that the pushback to this stuff is often just as stupid as the stuff itself. There's like us that are in the middle and we're trying to be nuanced and all of that. But, unfortunately, we get like the Chris Rufos of the world, and we get Fox News, and we get Tucker Carlson. And that is not really helping matters. We have this kind of war between two not very thoughtful extremes. And I still think that the vast majority of people agree with people like you and me. But what you're saying is that it doesn't matter because the elites have been captured by the extremes. I just can't believe that the elites would be that stupid.
I mean, that's what's interesting about it, because they're not stupid. They're the smartest people in our society. I mean, and I don't feel, I don't hesitate to say this, that the kids who go to Yale, to Harvard, they really are very bright, very hardworking, very conscientious, which is why it's so scary. It's not so much that I think the average person isn't. I agree with you that I think the average person doesn't agree with this. I would maybe I'll go further. I might say that even a good portion, I don't know how large of a portion of the elite don't believe in it, but they feel sufficiently pressured to say the thing that they need to say, which is essentially to parrot dogma unquestioningly. So, I mean, that's why I've been thinking so much about, how are the social dynamics working in this way to reproduce this ideology that is, as you said, stupid, right? But stupid, but being held by smart people, which is in itself like a very interesting situation. And then also something that's despised by the average person, and increasingly despised by the kinds of people who the elite champion, right? Like, it's weird to see, for example, I remember some New York Times, I forget exactly, Charles Blow, maybe, who published a piece after the last presidential election, when the polling results came back, and it seemed as if more Black people and brown people voted for Trump than in 2016, right? There was a movement towards Trump, right? And he couldn't cope with it. So his response was to call them, it's multiracial whiteness, white supremacy or whatever. So they have to find some bizarre way to make sense of what's happening, because it's clearly their ideology does not reflect reality, and they're going to increasingly find that they have to twist and twist and twist to make this work. So I'm hoping at some point it breaks. Just reason has too much weight in all this, and you can't twist anymore. And it becomes easier socially to actually just break out of it. But I'm not sure.
And why are you pessimistic, though? Because there are so many of us speaking out. I mean, our space, whatever you want to call it, it's gaining momentum every day, I feel like.
I mean, every time I have these conversations, like, you'll say this, and like I was having my last conversation was with Angel Eduardo and Melissa Chen.
Yes, I saw it on their perspective.
And they were basically, they were saying this to me as well towards the end. They were just like, "But Sarah," and I want to believe that things are going to get better soon. I think that it is that we've trapped ourselves in a situation. We're getting out, has a lot of negative consequences. I mean, what you're saying, that there are a lot of people that are like us that are speaking out now. I think a very small minority of us are able to continue on and make a living
Yes,
while
that's
espousing.
True. Don't say us either. That yes, exactly. It's not necessarily
right. I mean,
you or me.
I'm barely in this camp, right? But but there's so few of us for whom it is even like a reasonable dream that you can hold these views and still, be in the intellectual discourse in one way or another and make a living. For the vast majority of people, it's this is not a reality. This is not something they can count on. And to espouse these views means losing their job. Increasingly in the culture making institutions, right? Increasingly in academia, in the media as a whole, in various cultural, like just arts based institutions. So if you're in these kinds of spaces, these spaces which have huge influence on what we think as a society and how we feel as a society and how we, understand our current moments, and articulate them. If you want to participate and be a thinking person, you want to be a writer, you want to be a journalist, writing an anti-woke thing might get you blacklisted in so many different places. It's already hard to make it as a journalist. So, are you going to take this risk?
This is so interesting. You're 31. How old are you?
Yeah, about 30.
You're 30. Okay. So you have never really known a media landscape that's significantly different than what you just described.
No.
Is that fair to say? Okay. This is really interesting because I'm like 20 years older than you, a little more than 20 years older than you. And I've said this a million times on this podcast, but I came of age as a writer and a journalist in the early 90s when the job was to push back against easy narratives. You were supposed to surprise your reader. You were supposed to challenge them. You were supposed to kind of be counterintuitive. So I guess maybe I'm naive, but I think having had that experience and having cut my teeth in that kind of intellectual climate maybe makes me more hopeful. Like I can imagine getting back to that place, whereas you never even experienced that place. So I think that's something that maybe is really worth parsing, because there's a generational divide here where, and sometimes it looks like, oh, just the old people, we want to go back to the way it was because the white elites were profiting and the gatekeeping mechanisms favored us and excluded other people. So, there is that. But I also think that, for those of us who really spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff and know it's not just as simple as, regular run-of-the-mill gatekeeping mechanisms, there is a path back to the best aspects of how it used to be. We can get rid of the bad stuff while also recapturing the good stuff because we remember it.
So I'm of two minds about that. On the one, I think that there's, that's an interesting point, that maybe there's something about the institutions themselves that can outlast, this fever that's taken over, and that it breaks and then we, come out of it. But there's also something to be said about what that generational shift. And I think that's also one of the reasons that I'm pessimistic, is that the people that speak out about this, and I said this in my letter exchange with Aeon, she was like, so long as we have, liberal heroes like, Sam Harris and this person, she's
closer to my age. Yeah.
And I'm like, is any of those people, nobody she mentioned was like under 50, most of them were 60s, even, older. They are, incredible heroes, and they're pushing back, and they're creating this intellectual space. But the future belongs to the young, unfortunately, in this case. You
should have a bumper sticker. The future belongs to the young, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a generational aspect of it, and there's a hope in that too. In that, maybe this is a millennial thing. And the Zoomers will reject it in the way that the millennials rejected the kind of Enlightenment liberalism, and maybe we'll come back around to it, or to something different that's still better. But I think maybe that that has something to do with my pessimism, because all around me, other young women, I mean, to get back to the Islam, topic, time and time again, I saw young women dismissing the experience of adopting this sort of cultural relativist, we can't judge, who are we to judge stance on the hijab, sometimes even going as far as to say that it's empowering. And then it would be the second wave feminists who would say, what? It's sexism. It was so interesting to see, women my own age and dismissing the kind of feminism that I thought was the feminism. I thought that this was the last word on feminism. And then turns out there's this other wave, and there's this other new way of looking at things. And that new way of looking at things means looking at something like FGM and saying, well, maybe there's something positive here.
That one's tough to get your mind around. I mean, how do they possibly come up with an argument that FGM, this is female genital mutilation, it's a cultural phenomenon that a white Westerner cannot criticize?
Yeah, I heard that explicitly said multiple times, and it was shocking every time. One of those times it was said from a gender studies professor, which was really interesting. And by interesting, I mean like enraging, right? I saw it happen, and that's kind of why I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I think that there's a potential that the even younger generation that grows up within this kind of insane political atmosphere recognizes that there's something wrong with it and fixes it. And I think that might be part of why young feminists my age are able to adopt these politics, is because they're still living in a reality in which the sort of Enlightenment kind of liberalism was dominant and taken for granted, in fact, right? Entirely taken for granted. And so they cannot imagine a world in which due process isn't a thing, in which we really are treated as, members of a certain race or sex and not given any kind of legal rights or considerations outside of that, which is why they're flirting with it. They're flirting with those same ideas again, not knowing exactly where they'll lead, because they've never really encountered anything like it. So maybe there's a hope for the next generation. I will grant that.
Yeah, they're flirting with them on a kind of hypothetical academic level without looking at the practical application, what that might look like. Yeah, I feel like there's a lot of the discourse. It's as if people are in like a postmodernist kind of literary theory class. They're talking about issues in the realm of the hypothetical as a kind of thought exercise. I mean, without looking at the actual, effects on the ground. And that applies, across any number of political issues. Well, I mean, how do you, like, Sarah, do you have friends? Do you have friends your own age? Like, how do you function, kind of in the world socially? Like, what kinds of conversations do you have with your friends? And why do you think that you, as a 30-year-old woman, have not kind of gotten wrapped up in this?
I think I was, my experience with, ex-Muslim activism as it was kind of, it made what was at stake very clear at an early point in my intellectual development. So because of the stakes they're so severe in that context, that I've been thinking about some of these issues on a very fundamental level for a very long time. So I can't take them for granted. I don't take freedom of speech for granted. So I'm very protective of it. I don't take legal equality for granted. So I'm very protective of it. I don't take due process for granted. I think some of that is just like from the perspective from which I came, I wouldn't say immunizes me, but I think it definitely puts me in a position where it is the absurdities of it are very clear and have always been very clear. And in fact, distressing, right? Enough that I want to talk about it all the time. But as far as my friends, that's an interesting question. Socially, I'm in a very weird place. My offline friends, what I call offline friends, they're not very political people. And I think that's the only way for me to get about the world, which is just talk to people who just don't care about politics on any level. And they want to talk about gardening, and they want to talk about, the new gym that opened up. And they don't want to have these conversations. They want to have other conversations. And that's wonderful. My, closest friend from high school, like, she doesn't even know what I do exactly. Like, she's like, "Oh, you're on Twitter?" I'm like, "Yeah." So she doesn't know anything about it, and that's wonderful, because we can just talk about other things, and that's a great it's a great rest for the mind as well. But outside of that, those little oases of protection from the political discourse, my friends are all over the place. And what's interesting is apostates of all sorts come to me. And I mean, in the sense of not like religious apostates, but ideological apostates from any, they come to me and they share with me their experience of feeling like an outsider and feeling like they can't talk about what they want to talk about, which is, I think a lot of us have the same experience, which is really interesting. And it gives us opportunity to befriend someone as well, because you can, open up and talk about it. As I've become more open about these issues and well known about these issues, I've been able to build up a friend group that is composed of truly tolerant people. And by tolerant, I mean not just tolerant in that passive, like, oh yay, everybody's great kind of way, but in the old, civil liberties kind of sense, which is actually, I really disagree with you, but I, defend your right to think it and say it. And I actually won't even necessarily judge your character entirely based off of it, right? I will consider it as something that we can disagree on, and maybe I can convince you, that I won't peg you as necessarily someone who's pro-life or pro-choice, or, all these labels, these intellectual labels. So that's a wonderful thing. They're not all young though. Most of them are not young.
We're going to pause here for a short message from me. Are you appreciating this conversation and wishing there were more like it out there? Well, there are lots more right here. I do this show every week, and I pretty much do it all by myself. That is why, as much as I'm loath to ask for help, people who know me know this, I am offering this gentle reminder that if you value honest, thoughtful, nuanced conversations with all kinds of people, novelists, scientists, philosophers, comedians, journalists, sometimes even just regular folks with something interesting to say, I hope you'll consider supporting the show in any way you can. One way to do this is by joining our Patreon community at patreon.com/theunspeakable. You can join for as little as $5 a month. That gives you early and ad-free access to the show, or for as much as $100 a month. And yes, people have done that. There are lots of perks at every level, including, if you join at the $10 a month tier or higher, the chance to join our bi-weekly hangout, where we, and that includes me, get together on Zoom to talk about a recent specific episode of the show. Joining at that level also gets you discounts on your first purchase of official Unspeakable Podcast Nuanced AF merchandise. If Patreon is not your thing, you can also make a one-time donation in any amount by going to the podcast's webpage at theunspeakablepodcast.com and clicking the donation button. This podcast is a one-woman enterprise. I'm not affiliated with any institution, media company, secret investment cabal, or anything like that. I do it because I love it. And if you love it, or even like it, I hope you'll consider supporting it in any way that makes sense for you. Leaving a positive rating or review wherever you get your podcasts is a big help, actually. And telling people about the podcast, sharing it with friends, just spreading the word actually means more to me than anything. So thank you for listening to the show, for making the unspeakable worth speaking. And with that, back to the interview. Yeah. And, one of the things that I've been talking about a lot is the way that these sorts of divisions affect women differently than men, not to be gender essentialist, but there are, I was tweeting about this the other day. I think you might have seen it. Like, there are fewer women in this kind of free think heterodox space than men by a lot. It's a very male dominated space. And there are several reasons for that. But one of them is that think women are just on balance tend to be more sensitive to the social penalties that come from speaking out. We don't want our friends to not like us anymore. We don't want to hurt people's feelings. And so I think that you have a lot of, podcaster types and Substackers and YouTubers that are men. Obviously, there are us. We're here. There are a handful of women, but it's mostly men. And there are a lot of women. I'm assuming these are the same types of people that write to you that say, I've lost my friends. I've gotten kicked out of my book club. I got kind of pushed out of this Facebook group. So I'm wondering if you have thoughts about why there aren't more women speaking up. Maybe you have a theory that's different than mine, and just sort of what it's like for you to be a woman in this space. Do you get more pushback from other women than from men, for instance?
Yeah, I think your articulation of it is the bulk of what's going on here, and is something that I think can be hard for people to absorb because it references what may be,
biological differences.
Yeah,
we're gonna bleep that out. Bleep.
Right. So it references that, which is why it's sort of impossible to bring up. You have to do this in the social constructivist sense. You have to say women are
we're socialized
to care about right. Which is, I'm tired of doing it, and I won't do it anymore.
I wasn't. It's like if you met my parents, you would not believe that.
And it's logically it doesn't even make sense that literally everything is socially constructive, norms all the time, but they just happen to fall in one pattern throughout history and all human societies. When it comes to women and why it's hard for, I guess, this kind of intellectual work, I think that social penalties are a really big part of it. And, what you said, that women are more sensitive to social penalties. I also think there's more social coercion, from other women to other women. So there's both ends of it, that you have a person who's more sensitive to social stigma. And you also have, people who are willing to use it, perhaps because they recognize that it'll work. That will work better. And, perhaps in that sense, there are some, normative, practices or whatever, that have something to do with it. But certainly the social world of women is a very different social world of men. And I was thinking about this as I think we mentioned Jordan Peterson in our own conversations. And I mentioned him on Twitter, just why aren't there female Jordan Petersons, And I think there's something that Jordan Peterson isn't just, he isn't just a maverick or an interesting thinker, but he is somebody who's just so, deeply stigmatized that even to follow him carries a stigma. So I think that if you're a woman and you're a female leader who is, ideologically very, easily stigmatized, it's hard to find other female followers, even if you're speaking to them and speaking about their issues primarily. And then maybe men won't pay attention to you as much because they don't care about those issues. So there's a lot at work that makes it very difficult for somebody like this to come to the fore, and for alternative realms of discourse to crop up naturally in female spaces. I definitely see that. There's those what's it called, the male internet? What did they call it?
Oh, the manosphere.
Right, manosphere. These terms are so dumb, but the manosphere, as far as I know of it genuinely feels very toxic and kind of misogynistic at times. But it exists,
and it has a kernel of legitimacy. That's the thing. I think men's rights movement is fascinating. Personally, I think there's a lot of conversation to be had there. But unfortunately, it just gets it completely bastardized into this just ugly, poisonous, lowest common denominator kind of discourse.
Yeah, it's definitely clear that the broader culture, which is uniform, hates the manosphere and imposes a great deal of stigma on all of those conversations, anything related to those conversations. So that makes it very difficult for it to be anything other than poisonous and toxic. But it's interesting to me that still some men join it. The red pill or whatever is still very popular among men, despite the stigma. Female spaces are very different, and I'm on all sorts of like forums and whatever that are female heavy. There's a different way of speaking, even about like problems that are facing us. There's a different way of speaking. Like men speak in self-improvement terms and women speak in self-empowerment terms, right?
Self-care.
Self-care, right? Like there's like a tendency, I think, for that society, I think, internalizes the problems of men to men. The men are just too toxic and they just need to stop being toxic. But problems that befall women are externalized. It's society that's causing them.
Right. And we have to be a survivor. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's like if you're going to be self-empowered, it's this kind of girl boss, badass kind of thing. Like,
I mean, why
just be a
even
boss?
What is empowerment?
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Don't be a boss. Be a girl boss.
Be a girl boss. And all these terms that are just so ridiculous because they're ridiculous when you apply them to men, right? Boy boss, that's ridiculous.
Right.
I mean, it's infantilizing, right? So you recognize it as being silly because it is infantilizing, and you don't say that a man has become empowered. From a young man who was a dishwasher to now he's the CEO. He's become empowered. No, he's just in power
right.
now.
He found
his
voice, so he could become
right.
the CEO. Yeah. Well, you've written a lot of it, really interesting stuff about gender on your Substack lately. You wrote a piece about the dating economy, or what was it like? Standards of physical beauty and dating. I want you to talk about that a little bit.
Generally why dating advice sucks. I mean, it was
that's right.
This,
yes.
Kind of and I'm always interested in like the dynamics of something, so what are the incentives in place that are getting people to behave one way or the other? That's my go-to way of analyzing everything. So it was just my little piece on what's going on with the dating advice. And I think it has something to do also with just the conversation we had about women, which is there's an incentivization to, console people. It's also the dating world is also a world, I mean, similar to other cultural discourses that are kind of, poisonous on one end and not true or too simplistic on the other. It's, in the dating world, it's too easy to be problematic. It's too easy to talk about the realistic, formulas that are at play. What is actually attractive to women and what is actually attractive to men. And we just can't have this conversation because it's a very problematic conversation. And so it leads a lot of men to be confused. They think that they're doing the right things and they're not getting women. And then they get pulled into, red pill and all the manosphere or whatever. And for women, it leads to, a lot of women following this advice and then ending in a place where they're unhappy. A piece that I'm about to write on my Substack is about my experience in the DC area, which is where I am now. And a lot of women here are highly educated, like highly. This is one of the most educated places in the United States. Everybody has a master's. Like your bachelor's is not enough. And many people are very, very career oriented, very, very career minded. And the kinds of careers that they're going into, because it is DC, right? That's very professional, clean, not mavericky, taking chances kind of careers.
Yeah, very kind of buttoned down. Yeah.
Right. Like heads of foundations and, government relations officers for big firms, that kind of thing. And so it here, it's very clear to me, my friends here, I'm seeing this kind of this harm that's happening to these women develop and increase over time, where my friends are finding themselves, 39 and now they're finding out for the first time that, there's a window on their fertility, which is crazy. That's I think that's the craziest thing, but I've heard so many women say it, that they didn't realize that IVF was going to be as hard as it was.
I don't understand that either, because I thought we sorted that out like 20 years ago, because people were talking about that back in the 90s. Like, oh, wait, you mean there is a biological clock? And then I thought all the women's magazines ran pieces about it and, we course corrected it and everybody understands, but apparently not.
I don't think that happened at all. And if anything, I think it's still going to be, maybe not a crisis, but definitely something a ton of women that really didn't need to experience this are going to experience, and they're going to find that their future looks very different than they thought it was going to look. And I'm seeing it actively among my friends who are disproportionately, using all kinds of fertility, like on all kinds of fertility treatments, which are extremely expensive, extremely painful.
And talk about exclusive. I mean, talk about not inclusive. Mm-hmm, not everybody can afford those things.
Right. And I've been thinking about how are you here? How is it that someone who's so educated, so in tune with what's going on in the world, professional and empowered and all of these things, how are you here finding yourself at 42 or whatever and unable to conceive and surprised? So it's not that they're stupid. It's that they're not getting the cultural messages that would allow for them to course correct, I think, or at least the messages that what you're calling the correction messages were too easily dismissed.
Yeah, it's funny. So we're not allowed to talk about the biological clock because that is somehow sexist or disempowering or like. Yeah. It's funny because, I did I've done a lot of work around choosing not to have children, which is, a whole other thing. But I did an interview one time, the podcast, and, they were very friendly. The hosts were very friendly toward this topic, and they were, nice liberals and all of that. And they asked something like, well, there's also the issue of all these women being, told that the clock is ticking, and I said, well, it is ticking, that's a fact. And that part got cut out of the interview. I'm not sure why, maybe for time, but yeah, no, it's, but it is like the idea that women were sold a bill of goods, that phrase used to be used a lot around second wave feminism. Like, they were sold a bill of goods that they could have career and family at the same time, that you could have a really high flying career and raise kids. And that proved to be much more difficult than people realized. But now it's just, they're not even having the kids.
Well, I mean, I think part of the reason we're never going to get past this is because of, what we touched on for a second there, which is that there's biological differences. And so long as the culture won't touch on that, it's just men won't take care of, they won't take care of the equal childcare. They won't do it. And we just have to tell the husbands to stand up and take care of their kids. Right. But except that's not what's happening. Right. What's happening is that the mothers want to spend time with their children, or they have this long recovery period after childbirth or whatever, and they're breastfeeding and they want to breastfeed for a very long time. All these biological factors that you can't really argue with too much, that are influencing their decisions, and they need to be at least acknowledged as something that is other than socially constructed, because the solution presented is always, like we just need to tell men to do more, chores, and it's more complicated than that, actually.
Yeah, with your dating advice piece, you write, the real problem is that attraction is problematic. Lust is inherently discriminatory, objectifying, and deeply sexist and ableist and ageist. And while many desire to be lusted after and work to achieve, quote, fuckability, we tend to find it unreasonable, even cruel, to be rejected for that same reason. And that does line up with the point you were just making about, the division of household labor. There's just a real resistance to biological imperative. I mean, this is the naturalistic fallacy. I talk about this with Heather Hying, who's been on the show a few times. Just because we don't like something doesn't mean it isn't true.
And people don't want it to be true, right? So when it comes to young women, telling the message that I'm giving them is actually a really sad one, and they don't want to hear it. And the message that larger forces of the culture is telling them you can do whatever you want. You have plenty of time to choose, and you should achieve all the empowerment, and see the world and all these things. And those are all lovely things, right? But they come at a cost, and that just needs to be very clear to people. And it might not necessarily be a cost that you would have to pay because you could just not want kids. That's one, right? And that's the best.
But most
best
people,
case scenario
most
is
people
actually
don't want that. I mean, I'm an outlier. The vast majority of people do want to have kids.
Right. And I think the vast majority of women want to have kids and see that as like a cornerstone of their life, and as like an important milestone, in their life, to have kids and to be surrounded by family. And it's something we take for granted, I think, because we spend so much time trying not to get pregnant. Like when you're a young woman, you're trying not to get pregnant for a very, very long time, and then all of a sudden you can't get pregnant. And the situation flips, and that's why I think it's so disorienting as well, to suddenly face that. But we're not going to have a sane conversation on dating or on these kinds of norms that women are following, men are following, thinking that they will lead them to a fulfilling life. We're not going to have that conversation until we at least acknowledge that there's differences that we just have to put out there.
So is this more of your work these days? Like, are you sort of shifting away from the atheist space and talking more about these issues? Like, what's occupying your mind?
Yeah, I'm. It's not that I'm done with atheism. It's that that literal conversation of God and religion. Like, I'm done with that bit of it. The bit that I'm still very interested in is how we come to believe certain things, and what social forces work to keep us into false beliefs, or to convince us that false beliefs are in fact not false, right? So there's just a literal logical element of it, but I think the more interesting part for me is the psychology of belief and the psychology of disbelief. And more recently, I've been thinking about things in the mimetic kind of perspective, which is to say, rather than thinking of why people adopt a belief, it's how does a belief acquire followers, right? Sort of flipping the perspective a little bit, which is very interesting to me. And it can kind of be applied to anything, like any broken part of the cultural space. You can start thinking about it this way. Why is this, broken way of viewing things still the way we're viewing things? And often I find there's some interesting patterns that come up again and again. And then one big one is just a refusal to acknowledge reality for one reason or another. And what I'm wanting to do on my Substack is explore that a little bit. Like why when certain discourses in the culture are so broken, why is it that they get to be where they are? Not just that they're wrong, but why they're wrong, or why we have come to believe it, even though they're wrong.
You wrote in a recent Substack that we're shifting into a culture of honor versus a culture of dignity. And I think that's something that Jonathan Haidt has also talked about. But what does that mean to you?
It means to me that we're shifting into a culture that has a different kind of self-conception, I guess. What is right with how we behave, what is a right way to treat other people. And I formulate this a little bit on on what Jonathan Haidt has to say about it. But my experience with honor culture is different than obviously his experience with it. And my experiences with honor culture were a literal honor culture where men want to appear formidable, where reputation matters a lot, and that it is in fact more important than the search for truth, and that in fact the people's worth is something more than necessarily their reputation, right? So we become a culture where we focus a lot being sensitive to slights, whether they are feeling as if your biology holds you down in one way or another. We're focusing a lot on social equality, which I think is in itself a very kind of a bizarre concept. an impossible concept in a society where there's still a certain element of freedom. So I think there's something changing in our discourse that's approaching more of what Jonathan Haidt calls a culture of honor. And this is a culture where you settle things by really fighting it out, by ostracizing people, rather than articulating, the pros and cons of something, and achieving together a consensus on truth.
Okay, I'll have to think about that. But I think you're onto something. You're both onto something. Well, Sarah, this has been great. I'm really happy that I finally got a chance to talk with you, and I hope it's just the first of many conversations. I guess my last question is, given how how less than hopeful you're feeling about the current moment, what do you hope to achieve with your work? You want people to read what you have to say and listen to you, and feel a sense of alignment or kinship, or just feel less isolated when they come across your content. What do you want to give to the world?
I hope when they read my work that they will feel that they're not alone. All these things they're very important emotions. But what I really wish for people to for us to start doing together is to investigate more deliberately what we're doing and why. And especially when it comes to the stuff that seems very easy, the kinds of conversations I think that are the most toxic are the kinds that, as we've mentioned so many times in our conversation, have a very simplistic approach or a very, very, very complicated one as well. And I'd like for people to think about why they've come to adopt what they have adopted, to really adopt that kind of sense of skepticism that I started to adopt after I left the faith. And I think that was the one really wonderful thing about leaving religion, in that I felt, I was in this position where I thought I knew so much. I thought I was in possession of like this perfect truth. And then I found out that I really didn't know anything about the world, and my truth was probably false and maybe even harmful. And this caused this there's this deep-rooted skepticism that I adopted from then on, that I still carry, that I find to be really useful, and I find to be actually something that we could use more of in the culture, which is just to think about the fact that you may be wrong, to entertain other ideas. So much of what I see on Twitter that is just really broken discourse is people who, even they treat others as toxic for simply entertaining an idea, simply just saying, I think this is interesting. I retweeted this article. This was interesting. Just saying that can get you stigmatized and ostracized, which is so frightening. I mean, that alone is so frightening. And I want people to break out of that and to start to think of that as as not just something that is a bad habit, but something that is almost sure to lead to like harm, moral harm, real physical harm to people. That if we willingly close off our eyes and ears and refuse to look at the world as it is, there's a very real consequence to that. There are real lives at stake. And we touched upon this in the conversation too, about how this is sort of an elite game. So much of these cultural conversations with people who don't know what they're talking about. They don't know the real stakes. They don't know what certain policies might mean in the real world. I remember that was an extremely infuriating aspect of the conversation a couple of years back on looting. There were what seemed to me to be very privileged, educated, intellectual people making a case for looting. And it became clear to me right then that these people don't know what it's like to live in a actually marginalized community in society, and they don't know what the real consequences of the games that they're playing. They think that they're just games, but they're we're really this matters. This stuff really matters. And it matters that that our discourse is open, and it's open to the possibility of being wrong. And I've even said that about why I support, freedom of speech. It's not because I think that there's a common perception that you have the marketplace of ideas and it's open. And with the marketplace of ideas, you will eventually lead to, the truth. It's sort of an inevitable outcome. I don't think that's necessarily the case. I don't think what is true and what is good is inevitable, because often so many forces get in the way of us, accepting the truth or accepting the good. So there's an element of that has to be discussed. But the marketplace of freedom of speech is valuable because only in the case that we have freedom of speech, that we have this chance to air out the truth, is it possible for what is good and for what is true to win out in the end. So it's not a necessary win, but it is necessary to win, if that makes sense.
Oh, makes perfect sense. And it doesn't sound that pessimistic. That sounded almost optimistic. So hate to break it to
Wonderful.
you. I don't think we're quite as hopeless as we might feel on a moment by moment basis. Well, Sarah, thank you so much for talking with me and giving me all this time. And thanks for all the really important work that you're doing, and just for the way you conduct yourself. I have to say, you show remarkable restraint on Twitter, which I think is extremely admirable, and you're a great role model there. So
thank you. That's so good to hear, because I do definitely feel like I'm losing my mind on there all the time.
Okay, so not that I've noticed. So maybe I have to look closer. But you seem like you've got it together. So hats off to you.
Thank you, Meghan. And
yeah,
thank you for doing this, and thank you for hosting me. This has been such a fun conversation.
Well, likewise, and I hope we do it again. That was my conversation with activist and writer Sarah Haider. She has spent much of her professional life in the charitable world, co-founding 2 nonprofit organizations, including Ex-Muslims of North America. You can find her writing on Substack. Her newsletter there is called Hold That Thought, or you can find her on Twitter at sarahhaider. That's Haider. Once again, an extended version of this conversation, about 40 minutes more of it, is available on the Patreon page for this podcast at patreon.com/theunspeakable. You can hear more about Sarah's background, how she came from Pakistan when she was 7, and she grew up as a pretty observant Muslim in Houston, Texas, and how she eventually ended up a prominent figure in the atheist community. You can get lots of other perks if you join the Patreon, but if Patreon is not your thing, you can also make a one-time donation to the podcast in any amount by visiting the show's website at theunspeakablepodcast.com and clicking on the donate button on the homepage. Again, if you are interested in the Unspeakeasy, which is the heterodox women's community I'm in the process of creating, you can go to theunspeakeasy.com and see what it's all about. You'll also have the opportunity to fill out a brief form and tell me what you might want from such a thing. Again, that's theunspeakeasy.com. I'll be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Thanks for listening. See you next time.